The desert was quiet, but not dead. The sun hovered over the four corners of what we now call the American Southwest, casting long shadows across ancient cliffs, mesas, and winding canyons carved by time and silence. Here, the land didn't whisper, it remembered. And in that wind-scaped memory, thousands of years before our world turned digital and loud, a people known as the Anasazi, the Ancient Ones, carved out their world in stone. Imagine the year is around 850 AD. The air is dry, warm with the taste of dust and cedar smoke. You stand on the edge of a canyon, overlooking a tapestry of golden rock and crimson cliffs. The wind carries the soft rustle of cottonwood leaves, and somewhere the distant clinking of tools shaping stone. The Anasazi were not a lost people then. They were very much alive. They were builders, artists, astronomers, and spiritualists. They studied the stars, predicted the seasons, and listened to the breath of the land. From the baked earth, they coaxed corn, beans, and squash. From the stones, they built homes. First, pit houses dug into the ground, and later, grand multi-storied pueblos made of sandstone and adobe, nestled into cliff alcoves like hidden temples of earth. And from their spirits, they crafted stories passed from mouth to mouth, painted on canyon walls with ochre and charcoal, echoing still in the silence. A boy, maybe 9 years old, runs barefoot across the smooth sandstone, a rabbit-hide sling bouncing at his waist, his dark hair tangled in the wind. His name is Tayo, and his mother calls after him as the sun dips lower. His village sits high on the Mesa, several dozen families living in a circle of dwellings surrounding a central plaza and a kiva, an underground ceremonial chamber where the men of the village speak to spirits, to ancestors, and to the deep silence of the earth. The kiva to the Anasazi was more than a chamber. It was a link between this world and the other. Firelight flickers within, dancing on painted walls, spirals, lizards, cornstalks, rain clouds, symbols of balance, survival, the sacred order of things. Tayo knows not to enter without his father, but he always lingers by the entrance, nose twitching at the scent of burning sage and cedar. His people believe they came from the earth, from the Sipapu, an opening in the kiva's floor symbolizing the underworld from which the first people emerged. To them, the world is alive with stories. Everything is spirit, every rock, every bird, every drop of rain. And their lives are woven with that belief, harvesting, building, worshipping in rhythm with the sun and moon. These were not isolated cave dwellers. Their trade routes stretched hundreds of miles, turquoise from the south, seashells from the Pacific, macaw feathers from deep in Mesoamerica. They carved roads, some wider than the needs of foot traffic, leading to Chaco Canyon, a ceremonial center that stood like a stone heart in the desert. Chaco wasn't just a village, it was a marvel. Towering multi-story buildings with hundreds of rooms, perfect astronomical alignments, T-shaped doorways and intricate masonry rivaling the great civilizations of the Old World. On solstice days, sunlight pierced niches in the stone like a divine clock. The Anasazi didn't just live here, they aligned their lives with the universe.
But let us go deeper, not into myth or textbook, but into the heartbeat of a single day. In Tayo's village, morning begins before the sun. His mother grinds corn with a metate, rhythmic stone on stone. His father returns from a nearby field where he checked for signs of deer. His sister weaves yucca fibers into sandals. The village stirs, laughter, coughing, children squabbling over clay toys. Smoke begins to rise in thin blue tendrils from dozens of hearths. Elders sit in shaded doorways, speaking of clouds, wind patterns, and dreams. The Anasazi were attuned to nature not just for survival, but as communion. They could read the land like a scroll, a sudden bloom of cactus, a circling hawk, a cold wind from the north, each a message. Their calendars were not paper, but stone shadows. A priest of the sun might stand on a high ledge at dawn, waiting for the moment light touches a particular mark carved into the cliff. That instant signals planting season, Another mark at another time marks the harvest. Precision was their science. Spirit was their language. But life was not always calm. The desert was harsh, and cooperation was key. Water was everything. Rain dances were not performance, but prayer. Villages dug reservoirs, built check dams, and carefully channeled water to their crops. A mistake could mean starvation. Even then, droughts came. Crops failed. When corn wilted and pottery cracked in the dry heat, the Anasazi turned to the kivas, praying, fasting, offering turquoise or feathers to the spirits of rain. Sometimes they left. Entire villages, empty, silent, walls still intact, stand even today, abandoned not in chaos, but in solemn exodus. Perhaps water ran dry. Perhaps the spirits stopped answering. But let us not rush to endings. We are still in the middle of their story. The year is now closer to 1000 AD. In places like Mesa Verde and Cayenta, villages have grown larger. Pottery designs have become more intricate, geometric, abstract. Black on white, red on buff, patterns that tell stories known only to those who made them. Children are taught not only how to weave, hunt, and farm, but to remember, to pass down names, songs, migration paths.
Their language is never written, but it is never forgotten. In one home, a woman named Kachina paints a bowl with repeating spirals. She hums as she works, and her daughter watches. The spiral, she says, is the wind. It moves, but always returns. In another village, far across the plateau, an elder tells the story of the twins who brought balance to the world. Fires crackle, shadows dance, eyes widen. For the Anasazi stories were not entertainment, they were truth. They explained the stars, the drought, the snake in the canyon. They gave meaning to death, to birth, to the trail behind and the trail ahead. They gave the people a map, not of geography, but of soul. But the land was shifting. The climate, always fickle, began to change. Unknown to the Anasazi, the sun had entered a long cycle of variability. The rains that once came in summer began to falter. The years grew hotter, drier. Fields once green with maize turned brittle and gray. People adapted, moving higher, nearer to seeps and springs, building homes beneath cliffs to shelter from the sun. They grew more defensive, more aware of enemies. Perhaps it was the scarcity that bred competition, or perhaps, as some say, the gods grew silent. But not yet. In this moment, in the heart of the Anasazi world, there is still life, still celebration. A festival begins. Young men run in relay races across the desert, cheered by villagers. Women prepare roasted squash and thick corn mush flavored with wild herbs. In the kiva, men drum slowly as chants rise into the evening air. Flames flicker, faces glow. The stars emerge, uncountable, brilliant. A milky band across the sky, the path of spirits. The people dance. For now there is balance. For now, the world holds. And yet the wind carries a whisper, not a warning, but a wondering. Where will this road lead? Will the children of Teo still run these cliffs? Will the kivas still echo with prayer? Will the spiral return? The desert does not answer. It never does. It only waits, and it remembers. Part 2. Rise and Flourishing Communities. The Canyonlands had begun to sing louder now, not with voices of gods or ghosts, but with the sound of a civilization coming into full bloom. It was the 11th century, and the Anasazi, whom we now call the Ancestral Puebloans, were building something remarkable across the dry spine of the American Southwest. From Utah to Arizona, Colorado to New Mexico, their villages had swelled into cities, their paths into roads. their stories into structured rituals that span both generations and geography. Chaco Canyon, once only a quiet cradle of stone and sand, was now rising like an earthen cathedral under a burning sun. Here, in the middle of barren land and under a wide, indifferent sky, the Anasazi dared to build big. Massive stone complexes called great houses with rooms that numbered into the hundreds, built with incredible precision and skill. The walls were double-layered, filled with rubble and anchored with shaped sandstone, their patterns like woven fabric, each stone laid with a mason's love and a spiritual purpose. This was Pueblo Bonito, half-moon-shaped, 5 stories high, 600 brooms wide, a monument not to conquest or power, but to sacred harmony and cosmic rhythm. It didn't stand alone. Other great houses, Una Vida, Chetroqueto, Pueblo Alto, formed a constellation of spiritual and cultural power, each linked by straight ceremonial roads that cut across the desert with mathematical clarity as though drawn by giants. These roads were wide, often 30 feet across, elevated and engineered with astonishing foresight. They ignored obstacles, diving over cliffs, slicing through hills, crossing rivers, as if the builders were saying, "We do not bend to the land. The land will carry our lines." And these lines, as many believe, were not just trade routes. They were sacred paths, ways to connect earth with sky, man with spirit, time with eternity. At the heart of it all was Chaco's calendar. For the Anasazi were more than builders, they were watchers of the heavens. From Fajada Butte, a solitary stone rise at the canyon's edge, 3 massive slabs cast moving shadows on 2 spiral petroglyphs carved into the rock. On the summer solstice, a single shaft of sunlight slices through the stones and lands directly on the center of the spiral. On the winter solstice, 2 beams frame it like a doorway. This was not coincidence. This was deliberate, divine architecture. The sun was a god, and they had built him a calendar of stone. But Chaco was not merely a place of stone and shadow. It was alive. Traders arrived with baskets of goods carried on their backs across miles of punishing desert. Macaw feathers, copper bells, seashells from the Pacific coast, and cacao from Mexico all passed through these great houses. A priest from the north might sit across from a potter from the south, each offering gifts, each telling stories, each speaking of different winds and stars. Turquoise gleamed in the hands of craftsmen who shaped it into beads and pendants believed to carry the power of rain. Meanwhile, down in the canyons and mesas beyond, everyday Anasazi life thrived. Families rose with the sun and slept under the stars. Children laughed as they chased lizards through the sand. And women worked looms or stirred stews in clay pots. The air was thick with the scent of roasted corn, sun-dried chilies, and crushed sage. In villages like Mesa Verde, perched high in the cliffs, families carved homes directly into the canyon walls, an act of courage and ingenuity. These cliff dwellings, like Cliff Palace or Balcony House, were not random or haphazard. They were structured, protected, beautiful. They clung to the stone with a stubborn grace, catching the sun in winter and hiding from it in summer. Life was balanced here, between scarcity and abundance, between earth and sky, between the self and the community. Every person had a role: farmers, builders, potters, weavers, priests, storytellers. Even children had duties: gathering wood, scaring birds from crops, learning the ways of their ancestors. Pottery designs told stories without words: spirals for life cycles, zigzags for lightning, feather patterns for blessings. Each piece was more than utility. It was a message from hand to hand, from heart to heart. And the kiva, always the kiva, remained the soul of each community. Circular, semi-subterranean, always sacred. A ladder would descend into darkness and wisdom, where men met for ritual, governance, and connection. Songs filled the stone rooms, chants reverberated from plastered walls,
and prayers rose like smoke to the hole in the ceiling, the sipapu, the symbolic place of emergence. For the Anasazi, the past was not behind them, it was beneath them, around them, and inside them. Time did not move in lines, it curled in spirals, repeating, teaching. And with this mindset, they flourished. Their agriculture was revolutionary. Terracing hillsides to catch rainwater, digging check dams to trap runoff, and building waffle gardens with sunken beds to shelter young plants from wind and heat. Corn, always corn, was their life source, supported by beans and squash. The three sisters grew in unison, their roots and stalks complementing one another like family. And they experimented, growing cotton in lower valleys, even tobacco for ritual use. But it wasn't just the crops or buildings that told of a golden age. It was the art, the expression. Petroglyphs carved into canyon walls became more elaborate, shamanic figures with antlers and spirals in their hands, starbursts, and dancing figures that seemed to move in firelight. These were not just decorations, they were warnings, blessings, records, magic. Every symbol had meaning, and every meaning had power. The people of this era didn't just survive in the desert, they thrived with elegance. Marriage, kinship, migration, astronomy, rainfall, all were woven together in an intricate web of belief and knowledge. A grandmother might sing a lullaby to her grandson, and within the lullaby were instructions, how to find water, how to recognize a healing plant, how to behave when lightning struck the mesa. A ceremony might last all night, dancers painted in sacred colors, moving in unison with drums, their feet stamping prayers into the dust. And always, always they watched the sky. Comets, eclipses, full moons, each event was recorded not in books, but in memory and stone. The moon told them when to plant, the stars when to gather, the sun when to fast. Nothing was separate. All things, breath, blood, stone, and star, were one system. And yet, even amid this greatness, the seeds of struggle were already being sown. Some villages began to build walls around their dwellings, perhaps for defense, perhaps for hierarchy. Resource competition may have emerged. Rumors traveled of rival groups raiding food stores, of trade deals soured, of omens read in the cracked bones of deer. But for now, those shadows remained distant. For now, the land gave, and the people danced. A man named Kaletsi, the spiritual leader of a high mesa village, wakes before dawn and climbs to his lookout. He studies the stars, sensing a shift in the night wind. He speaks to the sky in the old tongue, offers a feather to the east. Below him, the village stirs. Women emerge from their doorways, shawls wrapped tight, eyes on the horizon. Children yawn and stretch. The smell of firewood and stone fills the air. A young girl, Nitha, grinds corn next to her mother, who sings a song about the first rains. Her brother carries water from the nearby seep, careful not to spill a drop. A potter names her new bowl after the moon, and a trader arrives with stories of a new road being built toward the far mesas, roads the spirits have revealed in dreams. This was the world the Anasazi built, not one of kings and wars, but of balance and vision. A civilization without metal, without wheels, without beasts of burden, but filled with harmony and purpose. The walls of their homes faced the right direction to catch winter sun and summer shade. Their villages were laid out like the stars. Their hearts beat in rhythm with the land. And for nearly 3 centuries, that rhythm held. For nearly 3 centuries, the Anasazi flourished like blossoms after rain. But in the distance, just barely, a change was coming. A whisper in the wind, a crack in the pattern, a faltering of the rains. The sky, once so generous, would soon grow silent.
But that is another chapter. For now, the drums still echo in the canyon, the roads still shine beneath the moon, and the desert still remembers the time when its stones danced in step with the stars. Part 3. Signs of Change. The sun had not dimmed and the stars had not fled, but something had changed, subtle at first, like a shift in the tone of a drumbeat or the silence between two heartbeats. The land still lay golden and vast beneath the wide skies of the southwest, but the winds now carried a tension, something that clung to the skin and made even the elders pause. For centuries, the Anasazi had lived in harmony with their world, but now, around the year 1130, something in that rhythm began to fracture. The rains, once faithful visitors, began to falter. The monsoons that once blessed the crops came late or not at all. Seeds withered in the dust. Beans struggled in dry soil. The great rivers pulled back from their banks like wounded animals. The people waited. They danced harder, prayed longer, watched the skies with deeper desperation. The kivas filled with smoke and songs of pleading. Ceremonial leaders spoke to the spirits, asking what wrong had been done. Had they failed to honor the ancestors? Had some promise been broken? But the spirits answered only with silence. The drought was not yet a disaster. It was a whisper, a warning, a shadow slowly stretching over the sunlit mesa. In Chaco Canyon, that sacred heart of the Anasazi world, construction slowed. The roads, once pathways of purpose, saw fewer travelers. Great houses stood proud but quiet, the rooms less occupied, their fires less frequent. Supplies arrived with greater difficulty, and ceremonial gatherings grew smaller. Still, the people endured. They were used to scarcity. They were desert-born. Yet beneath that patience, a quiet fear took root. In distant villages, the first signs of stress became impossible to ignore. Small farming hamlets, once self-sufficient, began to fail. Corn yields dropped, springs dried up. People began to migrate, leaving behind their homes, their pottery, even their dead. Entire settlements stood eerily empty, the footprints of 1,000 mornings suddenly gone. And with each departure, the burden on the larger communities grew heavier. Mesa Verde, Hovenweep, and the canyons of the Kayenta region began to swell with new faces, refugees from a disappearing world. At first, they were welcomed, but as mouths increased and resources shrank, hospitality gave way to caution. Villagers began building their homes higher into the cliffs, deeper into defensible positions. Watchtowers appeared on ridgelines. Storage rooms were sealed with stone. Something ancient and unsettling stirred in the people, something like distrust. There were whispers of theft, of raiders stealing precious stores of dried corn during the night. A basket left outside was no longer safe. The people who had once traded gifts now looked sideways at one another. Tension threaded through communities like cracks in a clay pot. And yet still they endured. They had to. The world they knew was unraveling, but they still held on to tradition, to ritual, to hope. They still rose before dawn to greet the sun. They still painted their pottery with care, still sang lullabies to their children about the spiral path and the ancestors beneath the earth. But their eyes, those quiet knowing eyes, had changed. They had begun to search the skies, not just for rain, but for answers. A boy named Tan, perhaps 12 summers old, sits beside his grandmother in a cliffside dwelling overlooking the vast valley below. She points to the dry streambed that once glistened like a ribbon of silver. "The water has forgotten us," she says softly, "but we must not forget who we are." Her voice is strong, but her hands tremble. She has seen too many seasons like this. Below, in the plaza, a gathering forms. The priests speak of a new ceremony, one older than memory, one meant only for desperate times.
They will climb to the highest peak and offer a dear heart to the sky. They will burn pine sap and speak the sacred name of the wind. That night, the village gathers in silence. Flames flicker, casting ancient shapes on the canyon walls. Drums pound like distant thunder. Faces are painted with ash and hope. They do not speak of fear, but it sits among them like a guest no one invites. In the morning, nothing has changed. The sun rises harsh and bright. The canyon walls glow, but the soil remains dry. Yet they continue. What else can they do? In some villages, new structures appear. Great towers built not for living, but for watching. Round structures with narrow slits placed on high ground with perfect views in every direction. These are not ceremonial. These are for survival. The Anasazi, once peaceful and open, are now building with defense in mind. The world has turned, and with it, their instincts. Stories spread of distant groups moving in from the north and west, fierce, unfamiliar, carrying different customs, seeking land, food, shelter. Perhaps they too were driven by the failing skies. Perhaps they were once like the Anasazi, now forced into desperation. But they are not welcomed. Not now, not in this fragile time. And so boundaries harden. Clans grow more insular. Once shared traditions become guarded secrets. Even within villages, divisions grow. Disputes rise over planting rights, water claims, leadership decisions. Factions form. A leader once respected might now face silent opposition. Where once there was communal decision-making, now there are hushed arguments behind stone walls. The social fabric, woven over centuries, begins to fray. And yet, art continues. The human spirit, even under pressure, finds ways to speak. On canyon walls, new petroglyphs appear, stranger, more intense. Spirals unraveling, figures with hollow eyes. A man with a hand raised against the sun. Some archaeologists, centuries later, would call this evidence of turmoil, psychological or social. Others would see it as prophecy. For the Anasazi, it was both record and release. In the sacred kivas, ceremonies take on a sharper edge. Songs plead more than praise. The children are taught not just to listen to the ancestors, but to prepare for movement. Migration stories become more prominent in the oral traditions.
The old stories of emergence from darkness, of long journeys through other worlds, now sound less like myth and more like warning. One night, in a canyon still untouched by conflict, a young woman named Siali wakes from a dream. In her vision, the canyon floods, not with water, but with people. Strangers, faces painted in red and black, pouring in through every pass. She holds her newborn tighter and whispers a prayer. She is not alone. Dreams like hers spread like wind-blown seeds. Omens are seen in bird flight, in the shape of cracked pottery and the howl of coyotes. The world is speaking, but its language has changed. Then come the fires. One village, then another. Storage rooms burned, walls blackened. Whether from enemies or from within, no one can say. But the message is clear. No place is beyond reach. Some villages dug deeper into their cliffs. Others vanished entirely, leaving behind only pots, tools, footprints, and dust. Archaeologists, long after, would find bones hastily buried, arrowheads embedded in walls, signs of struggle that history cannot soften. But for the people living then, this was not history. It was the air they breathed. The change was no longer coming. It had arrived. And still, they danced. Still, they lit fires,
told stories, made prayers. Hope, fragile as spider silk, still wove through their hearts. Perhaps the rains would return. Perhaps the spirits were only testing them. Perhaps this was the spiral returning, not ending. A cycle, not a doom. But deep within, even the strongest felt it. This was not just a dry season. This was a turning point. The roads were quieter now. Chaco, once the heart, no longer pulsed with energy. Its great houses stood like hollow drums, echoing with absence. Pilgrimages slowed, ceremonies shortened. Even the sun priests, once revered, now questioned. The Anasazi, who had carved harmony from stone, who had lived in tune with the cosmos, were now out of sync with the sky. The sun still rose, but its warmth no longer comforted. The stars still shone, but their patterns offered no reassurance. And the people, once anchored by land and lineage, began to look outward, not for trade, but for escape. The signs were clear to those who could see. The time of flourishing was over. What lay ahead was uncertain, but it would not be a continuation. It would be something else entirely. A new chapter written not in stone, but in footsteps. In leaving, in letting go. The desert, ever watchful, made no judgment. It simply watched and remembered.
Part 4. Crisis and Conflict. The silence was no longer peaceful. It had turned brittle, like pottery left too long in the fire, like a canyon wall bearing too much weight. The Anasazi world, once held together by stone, spirit, and sun, now began to crack, not with a single fracture, but with countless hairline breaks that crept across every surface of their lives. The year was near 1150. The drought had worsened. No longer a whisper, it howled through the canyons like a bitter wind. The rains, once unreliable, now vanished. Season after season passed with nothing but scorching sun and hard, cracked earth. Crops failed, water holes dried into dust, and the people, strong, resilient, faithful, began to suffer. Children cried at night, not from fear, but hunger. Grandparents thinned into shadow. Fields once greened with the sacred corn now lay barren. The sun, once revered, became a tormentor. The Anasazi had faced hardship before, but not like this. This drought was not a test, it was a sentence. And under its weight, the bonds of kinship and culture began to fray. The first signs of panic appeared not in screams, but in silence. Families packed up quietly and left. A village that had stood for a century might empty in a single moon. No farewell, no ceremony, just hollow rooms and cold hearths. At first, they sought nearby valleys, hidden springs, and shaded cliffs, but those too grew crowded, and with crowding came tension. Who owned the water? Who had rights to the fields? Arguments that once ended in laughter now ended in blood. An old man named Tolomi, a respected elder of a canyon village, stood between two feuding families. His voice calm, his arms raised. "This is not our way," he said, but his words fell into deaf ears and dried dust. That night, his granary was set aflame. The next morning, the fields were abandoned. People were changing. The drought did not just parch the earth, it parched the soul.
The kivas, once full of chanting and unity, now held only whispers and suspicion. The sacred ceremonies shortened or vanished. The spiritual leaders, once trusted to bring rain, now bore the weight of failure. Some were cast out. Some were blamed. Some were sacrificed. In one village, a young girl named Kiala watched as her uncle, a sun priest, was led away in silence. She clutched her mother's skirt and asked why. Her mother whispered, "Because the rains did not come. Because someone must be at fault."
The cliff dwellings of the late period were no longer just homes. They were strongholds, built high, hidden, with narrow entrances and ladders that could be pulled away. Mesa Verde, once open and communal, now looked like a series of watchtowers. The architecture told the story as clearly as any tale. They were afraid. They were preparing for war, not with strangers from far off, but with each other. Raids became common. Food was no longer shared, it was stolen. Villages began to seal off storage rooms with massive stone slabs. Hunters no longer hunted for the clan, they hunted to feed their own. Children were told not to speak to travelers. Songs of welcome became songs of warning. The roads, once arteries of trade, became channels of risk, and still they held on. Even amid collapse, the Anasazi clung to what they could. Pottery was still made, simpler, rougher, but still bearing signs of beauty. Stories were still told, though many now had darker endings. A father might speak of the twins who created the world and then whisper how one was betrayed by the other. The balance, they said, had been broken. In some places, cannibalism appeared, not in myth, but in the bones left behind. Long after, archaeologists would find human remains, burned, broken, scraped to flesh. Ritual or survival? No one could be sure, but something had snapped, a taboo shattered, a line crossed. Whether it happened often or only rarely, it stained a memory of a people who had once lived in balance. In one remote canyon, a village called Black Mesa lit its fires high into the night, not for warmth, but for warning, a signal to others, stay away. Within the walls, mothers rocked hungry infants. Warriors stood at the cliff's edge, spears in hand. Below, shadows moved. A rival group, perhaps once allies, now come to claim water, food, shelter. There was no negotiation. Only silence, then shouting, then fire. The night screamed. When the sun rose, the canyon was still, and the walls of Black Mesa stood blacker than before. The spirit of the people, the unity that had once defined the Anasazi, had turned inward, fractured into clans, factions, and fear. And yet, somehow, there was still endurance. In a high cliff alcove, a woman named Seika teaches her daughter to weave. Their home is no longer part of a village, but a scattered refuge. The girl listens carefully, her fingers mimicking the motion, the thread between them a line of hope. Even if we must leave, Seika says, you must remember this. This is who we are. The daughter nods.
The patterns she learns will one day be seen in Zuni, in Hopi, in Rio Grande villages far from here. The Anasazi are dying, but not vanishing. They are scattering like seeds on a windstorm. A migration has begun. Not a march, not a trail, but a slow, crumbling exodus, family by family, clan by clan. They carry only what they must. Seeds, stories, songs, and they walk. South, east, west, away from the centers they once built, away from Chaco, from Mesa Verde, from the towers and plazas now silent. Behind them, the great cities fall still. Walls crumble, roofs collapse, pottery shatters beneath dust and wind.
the land begins to take it back. But even as the villages fall, the people endure. They will become the ancestors of the Hopi, the Zuni, the Pueblo peoples. They will remember, not everything, but enough. Enough to keep the stories alive. But in this moment, in the heat of collapse, that future is not yet known. Only the present looms, harsh, unrelenting, filled with uncertainty. A grandmother looks out from her hidden cliff home at the setting sun. She murmurs a prayer, not for rain, not even for safety, but for strength. She does not ask the spirits to restore what has been lost. She only asks that her grandchildren survive long enough to find something new. And as the last rays of light vanish from the canyon wall, a wind rises, hot, dry, and full of dust. It howls through the empty plazas, the broken kivas, the scattered footprints. It does not mourn. It does not judge. It only remembers.
Part 5. Exodus and Migration. The sun rose, as it always had, casting long amber fingers across the canyon walls, warming the cliffs and brush with golden light. But it no longer rose over the same world. The villages, once alive with the voices of traders and the laughter of children, had gone quiet. The smoke that once curled gently from dozens of hearths had thinned to nothing. The kivas, sacred wombs of spirit and ceremony, were left in silence, their ladders splintering in the dry air. And across the vast and broken land, a movement began. Not of armies, not of conquest, but of sorrowful exodus. The Anasazi, children of the stone and sky, began to leave behind the homes of their ancestors. Not all at once, but like sand slipping through a cracked jar, village by village, family by family. They walked away not because they wanted to, but because the land had stopped answering their prayers. The secret cycles, the rains, the harvests, the sun rituals had broken. And now, carrying little more than memory, they set out into the unknown. It was not a trail of refugees in panic, but a pilgrimage of determination, of quiet survival. They did not abandon their identity. They carried it on their backs, in their songs, in the stories whispered into the ears of children under starlit skies. Picture them now, long lines of figures moving across a wind-whipped mesa, woven blankets pulled over shoulders, children tied to mothers' backs, elders gripping walking sticks as they descended into canyons and climbed out again. The sound of sandals on sandstone, the hush of wind, and the occasional rattle of a water gourd. A man named Nakai leads his family southward, away from the place his ancestors lived for over 5 generations. He does not look back at the cliff home that sheltered him as a boy, nor at the tower where his father once stood watch. To look back is too painful. Instead, he focuses on the mountain, on the horizon, known in stories as a place of emergence. His daughter, barely 10, walks beside him. She carries a small clay bowl, the last her mother made. Inside, wrapped in yucca fiber, are blue corn seeds, the hope of tomorrow. They head toward the Rio Grande valleys, where they've heard rumors of water, of people, of rest. But they know that journey is long, and that not all will make it. They pass other groups moving in different directions, west toward the Hopi Mesas, east to the plains, some disappearing into the folds of unknown canyons. Each group carries its own version of the story, its own fragment of the shattered whole. Some traveled in silence, others sing to keep rhythm, to keep fear at bay. They sing songs about emergence, about the underworld from which the first people came. They sing of the hero twins and the road of the sun. They sing to remember. They must, for as the homes crumble behind them, the only way to preserve the people is to carry the spirit forward. Along the way, they build temporary shelters, small brush huts near springs, stone lean-tos beneath ledges, but none are meant to last. Their footprints scatter across the desert like scattered beads, and even in this hardship, they find beauty. A boy etches a spiral into a canyon wall with a piece of obsidian. A woman weaves a basket while seated beneath a pinon tree, its needles whispering overhead. The stars remain, brilliant and watchful. The moon, in her cycles, becomes their companion. They follow her phases as they once followed the guidance of sun priests. The cosmos remains, if not kind, at least constant. And so they move, from the great Chaco roads to the hidden box canyons of southern Colorado, from the towers of Hoven Weep to the open sky mesas of Arizona, from the broken kivas of Mesa Verde to the riverbanks of the Rio Grande. This was a migration not of one people, but many. A diaspora of clans, each with its own totems, dialects, customs. Some merged with other cultures along the way. Some disappeared entirely. Others settled in places that would become the new homes of the Pueblo peoples. In the northern mesas, a group settles atop First Mesa. They build new homes, smaller, tighter, more defensive. They dig new kivas, sing old songs, teach children the names of the stars. They are the ancestors of the Hopi. Farther south, near the confluence of rivers, another group rebuilds. They speak in a tongue that blends with others, and over time, their distinct Anasazi ways soften and evolve. They become the Zuni. In the Rio Grande valleys, communities emerge, tight-knit, sun-baked pueblos built from adobe. Here, too, the Anasazi seed takes root. In the heart of these new villages, the old traditions stir. Not all survive, but many do. Hidden in dances, in pottery designs, in prayers whispered before sunrise. The spiral pattern etched into pots and stone continues to appear. The kiva, though altered, remains a place of reverence. And above all, the stories persist. A grandmother tells your grandson about a city of stone far to the north, where the sun once spoke through shadows. She speaks of long roads that led nowhere, and of a time when people lived in harmony with the land. The boy listens, his eyes wide. He has never seen Chaco, never stood beneath the towering cliffs of Mesa Verde, but in his heart he carries it. For the Anasazi did not vanish.
They transformed. They dispersed like pollen, like seeds, like starlight. Their disappearance was not an end, it was a scattering. The great cities may have fallen silent, but their spirit echoed on, in the languages, the rituals, the very breath of their descendants. Yet for those who walked the roads of exile, it was a painful journey. Elders died along the way, buried beneath piles of stone. Children were born in the crypts of dry arroyos, their first cries echoing off canyon walls. Ceremonies were adapted, songs shortened to fit the pace of migration. The burden of memory became heavier with each step. Who would remember the full moon dances, the names of the great houses, the songs sung to the constellations? Every step away from the homeland was a step into forgetting. And yet, the people persisted, because they had to, because survival was not just for the body, but for the soul, the culture, the connection. They learned to read new landscapes, to find new springs, to sow corn in unfamiliar soils. They learned to live with neighbors who spoke different words, who worshipped different gods. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they married. Always they adapted. And in the quiet moments, they remembered. The Anasazi disappearance is not a tale of extinction, but of metamorphosis. It is the story of how a people, tested by the cruelty of nature and the pressures of society, chose to endure by letting go, by walking away from stone and staying true to spirit. A migration of not just bodies, but of identities, of worldviews. The cliff dwellings would crumble. The great roads would vanish beneath sand. The petroglyphs would fade, but the stories would remain. Whispers in the wind, patterns in pottery, songs in the breath of a people who still look to the horizon with reverence. And so, when you stand today in those ancient ruins, feel the silence, not as emptiness, but as echo. Listen. You may hear footsteps in the wind, not fleeing, but searching, not lost, but becoming.
Part 6. New Settlements and Legacy.
They walked away from their sacred cliffs, from the great houses etched into stone, from the roads that vanished into the desert horizon, but they did not walk into oblivion. The Anasazi, or rather the people we now call the Ancestral Puebloans, did not disappear as myth suggests. Instead, they scattered like seeds on a restless wind, carried by memory, guided by stars, and whispering prayers to ancestors as they crossed into new lands. The land they left behind grew quiet, yet the land ahead slowly awakened to new footsteps. They arrived in waves, first in trickles, then in steady streams, clan by clan, to regions that still held the promise of life, where rivers ran, where springs welled up from rock, where mesas stood watch like silent elders. And in these new places, they began again. In the valleys along the Rio Grande, new pueblos rose, made not from the pink sandstone of Chaco or the sculpted cliffs of Mesa Verde, but from adobe, straw, and stone molded by hand and sun-dried beneath the sky. These were smaller villages, tightly packed and cautious, ringed by fields of corn, beans, and squash. Here, the people who had once built astronomical monuments and vast ceremonial roads now built communities that valued resilience, adaptability, and closeness. No longer the sprawling urban centers of old, but new beginnings rooted in necessity and memory. The descendants of the Anasazi, now taking on distinct identities, Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, Laguna, Taos, Santo Domingo, and many others, brought with them fragments of their ancestors' world. Some carried songs that had never been written down, sung to babies by firelight. Some carried dance steps learned by watching shadows move across the kiva floor. Others remembered the stories, the spider woman who spun the world, the twin heroes who shaped the land, the sacred sipapu that linked this world to the next. These stories were not stored in books or stone. They lived in the breath, in the heartbeat, in the rhythm of everyday life. And in these new settlements, memory took root. In the Hopi mesas of Arizona, homes rose atop high cliffs once more, not because of tradition alone, but because it offered protection, vantage, and connection to the divine. The Hopi built their villages on first, second, and third mesas, stacked with adobe houses and vibrant murals painted onto plastered walls. They developed elaborate ceremonies tied to the seasonal cycles, carrying forward the spiritual essence of their ancestors, but giving it new shape. The Katsina spirits, ancestral beings who bring rain and teach proper living, became central to their worldview, and the dances held in their honor were performed in plazas, just as they once were in Chacoan ceremonial centers. In these ceremonies, the veil between the past and present grew thin. The Hopi did not see themselves as modern or separate. They were the continuation of a sacred line. They did not forget. Farther east, along the Rio Grande, other groups found their homes beside rivers and fertile fields. They formed compact pueblos, multi-storied structures built around central courtyards connected by narrow alleyways and aligned to the cardinal directions.
Here, the legacy of the Anasazi lived in architecture, in agricultural patterns, in the shared kivas still built at the heart of every community. The communal spirit of the old world had survived, but it had been tempered, focused inward, shaped by the harsh lessons of migration. The people no longer needed monumental architecture to prove their presence. Their strength was in their continuity. Their language evolved, yet retained the sounds and syntax of the ancient tongue. Their pottery changed forms, but the spirals still appeared. The weavings became more colorful, more symbolic, stories told in thread, pattern, and dye. Women taught daughters how to shape clay, how to feel the right moment to pull a pot from the fire. Men taught sons how to read the land, how to respect the clouds, how to listen for the whisper of deer in the brush. Elders told children about the cliffs, the great canyon roads, the drought that tested the people, and the stars that never stopped watching. These weren't just tales, they were a manual for survival. And as time passed, these new pueblos became permanent homes. They weren't simply survivors, they were stewards. They tended to the land, respected the water, danced in gratitude for rain, and treated life as ceremony. Even the planting of corn was done with prayer, with reverence. The memory of the collapse was never far. It was etched into the culture like a scar that reminded, warned, and instructed. Do not take more than you need. Do not forget the cycles. Do not turn away from your ancestors. The old places, Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, Hovenweep, did not vanish from memory either. They became sacred again, but in a new way. Pilgrimage sites. The ruins were not seen as lost cities, but as ancestral footprints. Each broken wall, each silent kiva, was a reminder of the greatness that once was, and the fragility that follows forgetting. Every generation was taught to remember, these are not just ruins, they are who we were, who we still are. To outsiders, centuries later, it may have seemed the Anasazi had disappeared, but that was because they looked for continuity only in stone. They did not understand that culture can survive without walls, that legacy can live in a song, in a dance, in the way water is drawn from the earth with gratitude. The Spanish would arrive in the 1500s and call these people pueblos after the village structures. The name stuck, but the people never forgot who they were beneath the label. Beneath the Catholic missions, the forced conversions, the brutal colonization, the ancestral heartbeat continued.
It pulsed beneath the surface, in secret ceremonies held under moonlight, in prayers whispered into clay jars before sealing, in the way a cornstalk was placed on an altar with 3 grains of salt. Even resistance carried echoes of the old world. In 1680, during the Pueblo Revolt, when the Pueblo peoples rose together and pushed out the Spanish invaders, it was more than political, it was ancestral. It was a reminder that the people of the cliffs had not vanished. They had adapted, survived, endured. And now, today, if you stand in those modern pueblos at Hopi, Zuni, Taos, Acoma, you can still feel the pulse. It's in the beat of the drum, the rhythm of the dancers' feet, the firelit eyes of elders telling stories that stretch back not decades, but millennia. Children still learn how to make blue corn mush the old way. Young men still climb the mesas before dawn to watch the sun rise on solstice morning, just as their ancestors did on Fajada Butte. Women still paint pottery with careful hands, repeating patterns passed down through 800 years. And the stars still turn overhead, as they always have, as they always will. The Anasazi were never lost. They walk among us, in the laughter of Pueblo children, in the steady hands of their artisans, in the sacred silence of their ceremonies. Their legacy is not a mystery to be solved, it is a lineage to be honored. And if you listen closely, beneath the rustle of corn, the whisper of sagebrush, the dry hush of desert wind, you may hear it still, the quiet, enduring echo of the people who walked away from stone, but never from spirit.
Part 7. New Settlements and Legacy. Time, like sand through canyon cracks, has a way of burying stories, but not erasing them. What the Anasazi left behind was not merely ruins and relics, but a riddle.
For centuries, those who stumbled upon the silent cities, cliff dwellings perched like nests in impossible stone, abandoned kivas still marked with soot, massive roads leading nowhere, asked the same question. Why did they leave? What happened to the people who once built an empire out of mud, stone, and spirit in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth? To the untrained eye, it seems like they vanished, as though the wind had picked them up and scattered them like dust. But the mystery is far deeper than disappearance. It is a mystery rooted not in the fantastical, but in the fragile balance between humanity and nature, society and survival. Over the years, scholars, archaeologists, and even spiritual seekers have journeyed into these forgotten canyons, kneeling beside crumbling walls, decoding petroglyphs, brushing away centuries of dust in search of answers. And they've uncovered many theories, some grounded in evidence, others in speculation, all part of the grand puzzle of the Anasazi. The most widely accepted explanation begins with the land itself. The American Southwest, though hauntingly beautiful, is merciless. Around the late 1100s and into the 1200s, evidence from tree rings, lake sediments, and climate models point to a catastrophic drought, one that lasted decades, not years. Rain became scarce, springs dried up. Even the most advanced agricultural techniques could not coax food from dying soil. For a society that depended so completely on the rhythm of nature, the silence of the sky was an existential crisis. Starvation, dehydration, and displacement became the bitter reality. But drought alone does not collapse civilizations. It pressures them, forces choices, triggers migrations, but rarely shatters them entirely. Which leads to the second theory, social upheaval. As resources dwindled, competition intensified. Some villages grew hostile. There are signs of increased fortification in the later sites, defensive structures, walls, hidden entryways. The famous cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, once assumed to be scenic abodes, now appear more like strongholds, chosen for their defensibility. At sites like Sand Canyon and Castle Rock Pueblo, archaeologists have found evidence of violent conflict. Skeletal remains with trauma, mass graves, signs of cannibalism, fractured bones, cut marks, burned remains. These are not isolated incidents. They suggest widespread unrest. Perhaps rival clans fought over water, over fertile ground. Perhaps a breakdown in spiritual leadership, where ceremonies failed to bring rain, caused panic and blame. The Anasazi, for all their sophistication, were still human. Fear breeds conflict, desperation cracks order. And when a society built on harmony turns to survival, shadows emerge. Then there's the theory of political collapse. Chaco Canyon, the ceremonial and economic heart of the Anasazi world, was not just a cluster of buildings, it was a centralized system.
Great houses, outlying roads, ritual calendars, and elite classes of religious leaders suggest a complex web of control. But centralization is fragile. When the rains failed and faith wavered, those at the top may have lost influence. Peripheral communities, once loyal to Chaco's spiritual authority, began to fragment, to seek new ways, or to leave altogether. The once unified culture unraveled into smaller, scattered groups, each interpreting the crisis in their own way. Some may have followed new prophets. Others perhaps abandoned the old gods. What happens to a society when its center cannot hold? It dissolves, not into chaos, but into diaspora. 1,000 stories, all rewriting themselves. But there are other theories, more subtle, more human. Disease, for example. Though evidence is limited, it's possible that pathogens, brought by trade or by climate shifts, ravaged certain regions. Malnutrition would have weakened immune systems. Close communal living with limited sanitation would have spread illness rapidly. If a village was struck by something mysterious and deadly, it might be abandoned not from fear of enemies, but of spirits, of contagion. And there's the psychological theory, spiritual crisis. Imagine a world where every sunrise is sacred, every planting timed to the moon, every drought a message from the gods. Now, imagine that world stops responding. The kivas go quiet. The rituals no longer bear fruit. The sacred spiral seems broken. For a deeply spiritual people, this would have been shattering. Faith, once a foundation, becomes a source of fear. Perhaps entire communities decided to move in search of spiritual renewal, to find a place where the old songs might still work, to find forgiveness. There are even whispers of environmental degradation, soil depletion from overfarming, deforestation from overharvesting timber for fuel and construction. A feedback loop. As the population grew, so did the need for resources. But the desert, though vast, has limits. Once trees are gone, erosion sets in. Once topsoil vanishes, crops fail faster. Without modern tools, there's no easy fix. The land rebels, and the people listen. But some theories wander into the speculative and strange. Ancient alien theorists have pointed to the architectural precision of Chaco Canyon, the astronomical alignments, the vast road systems, wondering aloud if extraterrestrial influence played a role. These ideas, while imaginative, often ignore the deep scientific and cultural brilliance of the Anasazi themselves. They didn't need aliens. They had math, observation, generations of skywatching, and a spiritual worldview that made precision sacred. Others speculate about massive migration sparked by visions, dreams, celestial events. A supernova recorded in petroglyphs, solar eclipses interpreted as omens. To the Anasazi, such signs were not merely astronomical, they were divine messages. Perhaps one such event told them to move, to leave behind the corrupted places, to find a new center. Then there are stories, still told by Pueblo elders, of clans who left because it was time, not because of failure, but because of prophecy, because the cycle had ended. The migration was part of a greater plan. The spiral, after all, doesn't close. It continues outward. The movement itself was sacred. These oral histories are not concerned with collapse. They speak of continuity, of honoring the seasons of the world. To leave was not to fall, but to follow the sacred path. And that is perhaps the most profound theory of all, that the disappearance of the Anasazi is only a mystery to those who don't listen, to those who believe that permanence is proof of success. But in the Pueblo worldview, change is not failure, it is flow. The kivas of the past were not meant to be eternal, they were steps on a longer journey. The roads didn't end, they simply turned. In the end, the truth of the Anasazi disappearance may not lie in a single cause, but in a convergence, drought, conflict, spiritual crisis, and cultural evolution, all braided into one sweeping movement of people, across decades, across generations, a migration not of panic, but of resilience. And if we listen, not just to the ruins, but to the voices that still echo in the pueblos of the Southwest, we might understand that the mystery is not where they went, it's how they survived, how they transformed, how they became rivers feeding into new cultures, new settlements, new spiritual lineages. The spiral continues. The journey is not over. And somewhere in the whisper of wind through broken stone, and the laughter of children dancing at a modern Pueblo festival, in the quiet gaze of an elder who remembers what others have forgotten, the Anasazi still walk, still speak, still endure.
Part 8. Epilogue and Reflection. The desert is quiet again. The great houses of Chaco stand hollow beneath the sky. The kivas are roofless, open to stars, their ladders long gone. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde sit like fossilized dreams, tucked into the embrace of the canyon wall, their doorways watching eternally over the empty valley. Wind
moves through them, slow and reverent, like breath through a sleeping giant. And yet, this silence is not empty. It is full of memory, full of presence, full of spirit. To the untrained eye, the Anasazi vanished. But when you stand among their ruins, when you touch the stones still warm from the sun, when your shadow joins theirs on the canyon floor, you begin to feel something deeper, a rhythm, ancient and alive. The story of the Anasazi is not one of disappearance, but of transformation. They walked away from the walls they built, not from the world they shaped. They didn't leave behind a mystery to be solved, they left behind a legacy to be honored. The spiral of their journey continues, not in ruins, but in the living hearts of their descendants. Stand in Taos Pueblo, where adobe homes have stood for over 1,000 years, and you'll hear the echoes of the old language still spoken. Attend a Hopi ceremony, and you'll see dancers in feathers and masks moving with the same purpose their ancestors did beneath the canyon moon. Walk through the plazas of Zuni or Acoma, and the patterns on the pottery, the rhythm of the drum beats, the call and response of sacred songs, they all point back to Chaco, to Mesa Verde, to the high desert long ago. The ancestors are not gone. They are embedded in every sunrise over First Mesa, in every painted Katsina mask, in every prayer tied to a cornstalk and left to flap gently in the desert wind. To reflect on the Anasazi disappearance is to examine not just the fall of a people, but the rise of a lesson about resilience, about humility before nature, about balance and the consequences of imbalance. They remind us that even the most advanced civilizations, those who can predict solstices, carve roads through stone, build cities without wheels or beasts of burden, are not immune to the forces of change. The droughts that tested them were not mere weather events, they were spiritual trials. The migrations they undertook were not defeats, they were sacred continuations.
They didn't stay and perish. They left and preserved. That's not disappearance, that's wisdom. And so we are left with footprints, with the sound of wind through doorways where voices once sang, with the silent sun clocks carved into canyon rock, with roads that vanish into sagebrush, with pottery fragments that still bear the fingerprints of those who shaped them centuries ago. We are left with questions, yes, but also with invitations. Invitations to listen deeper, to learn not just from what the Anasazi built, but from what they chose to let go. To understand that civilizations aren't defined by how long they stay in one place, but by how well they adapt when the world begins to shift beneath their feet. Their story is still being written in the DNA of their descendants, in the preservation efforts of archaeologists and tribes, in the prayers whispered at dawn over cornfields, and in our own reflection as we face a world that is once again shifting through climate, through culture, through questions of how we live and what we value. The Anasazi faced the crossroads, and they chose the path of the spiral. Not backwards, not forwards, but circling towards something deeper. We too are at a crossroads. What will we carry? What will we leave behind? What songs will our descendants inherit from the way we lived, the way we treated the land, each other, ourselves? The wind still moves through the old stones. The stars still rise over the canyon. The same moon watches us now as it watched over them. And in that light, we are not strangers to the past. We are its continuation. The Anasazi did not disappear. They are walking beside us still.